Hello everyone. Today you will learn interesting facts about the Middle Ages, but before we step into castles, knights and kings, let me take you even further back, to the brutal world of ancient Rome. You see, when the Romans crushed their enemies, the battlefield wasn't the end of the story. For the wives and daughters of defeated leaders, survival itself became a punishment. They were dragged in chains through crowded streets, mocked by roaring Roman crowds, and forced into lives that stripped away every ounce of dignity. For some, death would have been mercy, but Rome preferred something far worse: humiliation, slavery, and the erasure of an entire legacy. Hello everyone! Today you will learn interesting facts about the Middle Ages, but before knights and castles, let us step into the ruthless heart of ancient Rome, where victory was not just about battles, but about crushing the soul of the enemy. When Rome defeated a king, his people were not the only ones who suffered. The wives and daughters of those fallen rulers often faced a fate more terrifying than death itself. Imagine being a queen one day, surrounded by respect, wealth, and loyal guards, and the next dragged through the streets of Rome in chains. The Roman triumph, their victory parade, was both celebration and humiliation. The general who won the battle would ride in a golden chariot, cheered as a god among men. Behind him walked the defeated, chained kings, nobles, and their families. The queen, once revered, became nothing more than a spectacle, her silk gowns torn, her head forced low while the crowd jeered. Children who once called her mother were now orphans of empire, displayed like trophies. For Rome, this was more than cruelty. It was a message: resist Rome, and not only will you lose your kingdom, but your honor, your family, and your very legacy will be destroyed. Death was quick and clean. Survival was a curse. Take the example of Perseus of Macedon, who dared to defy Rome in the 2nd century BCE. When he lost, his wife and children were paraded in Aemilius Paulus's triumph, stripped of their royal dignity before being sold into slavery. To the Romans, this was entertainment. To the captives, it was the slow erasure of everything they were, and sometimes it didn't stop there. Noble women could be forced into Roman households, married off to soldiers, or worse, turned into slaves for public use. The once proud queens became a living warning, their survival twisted into Rome's greatest weapon. This was the brilliance and the horror of Roman conquest. They didn't just kill their enemies, they broke them piece by piece until even their memory was owned by Rome. And this is only the beginning, because in part 2, you'll discover just how far the Romans went to make sure their enemies' wives and daughters lived lives of humiliation far darker than any battlefield death. When we think of defeat in war, we imagine the slain warriors, the broken armies, the banners torn apart. But in Rome, true punishment did not end on the battlefield. It followed the families, especially the wives and daughters of the defeated. And here is where Roman cruelty showed its sharpest edge. For the Romans, a woman's body was more than just flesh. It was a symbol of power, lineage, and legacy. And what better way to erase an enemy's memory than to control his family's bloodline? Many noblewomen, once queens and princesses, were sold into slavery. But this was not ordinary slavery. Some were paraded in the markets, their identities stripped away, forced to live as common servants. Others were taken into wealthy Roman households, where they became concubines or attendants, constant reminders that their royal blood meant nothing in the shadow of Rome. Worse still, some were given as rewards to soldiers, forced into marriages that were never chosen, never honored. Imagine a queen who once commanded respect from her people, now forced to serve as the wife of a soldier who saw her as nothing more than spoils of war. Her children would no longer belong to her people. They would be born as Romans, raised in the empire of the very men who destroyed her world. This was deliberate. Rome didn't just conquer land. They conquered futures. By binding noble women to Roman men, they erased dynasties, destroyed bloodlines, and ensured that no kingdom could rise again from the ashes. The humiliation was often worse than any public execution. For these women, every day alive was a reminder of what they had lost: their titles, their freedom, their family, their legacy. Consider the story of Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. After her parents' defeat, she was paraded in chains during Octavian's triumph. Though spared from death, she was married off strategically to a Roman allied king. Her royal Egyptian identity was erased. She lived, but as a tool of Rome's political machine. Survival was not mercy. It was a life sentence of servitude, a slow erasure of identity. Rome mastered the art of turning survival into the cruelest punishment of all. And in part 3, we'll go even deeper, into the spectacle of humiliation. Because sometimes Rome didn't just enslave or marry off these women. Sometimes they used them as entertainment, turning their suffering into a public show for the roaring crowds of the empire. By now, you've seen how Rome turned survival into a curse, enslaving, marrying off, and erasing the identities of conquered queens and noblewomen. But sometimes Rome went even further. They didn't just want to destroy an enemy's family. They wanted to make their suffering a show. The Roman people loved spectacle, and humiliation became entertainment. After great victories, generals staged triumphs. Massive parades through the streets of Rome. Citizens cheered, music thundered, banners waved. But at the very center of it all, shackled and broken, walked the defeated rulers and their wives. This was no accident. The women were dressed in torn, filthy versions of their once royal gowns. Their jewels ripped away, their heads forced down as the crowds mocked them. Sometimes their children were dragged alongside them, crying, confused and terrified. The Roman message was clear. Look at what happens to anyone who dares resist the empire. The spectacle often ended in the arena. Some royal captives, men and women alike, were executed before cheering crowds, strangled or beheaded at the climax of the parade. Others were forced to live on in slavery, their misery providing endless gossip for Roman elites. For the noblewomen, this was the sharpest blade, to be paraded as trophies, mocked as spoils, and left alive only to suffer further. One infamous example was the family of Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who dared to defy Caesar. After years in chains, he was paraded during Caesar's triumph, while his people, including women and children, were displayed as living proof of Rome's dominance. The women were stripped of their dignity, enslaved, and scattered across the empire, never to see their homeland again. But the Romans were clever in cruelty. They knew that killing a queen quickly made her a martyr. Keeping her alive, degraded, enslaved, powerless, made her a warning. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a living monument to Roman power. Imagine standing in the Colosseum as thousands roared. A queen who once commanded armies now stood in rags, surrounded by guards, while the crowd laughed at her misery. For Rome, humiliation was not a side effect of conquest, it was the strategy. And in part 4, the story grows darker still. Because the Romans didn't just humiliate, they weaponized women, using their survival to break nations, erase cultures, and ensure that rebellion would never rise again. By now you understand that Rome's cruelty was not random. It was carefully calculated. They didn't just humiliate women to break their spirit. They weaponized them. For the Romans, wives and daughters of defeated rulers were more than spoils of war. They were political tools. By controlling them, Rome controlled the future of entire nations. How? Through forced marriages and hostage politics. Imagine being a princess, the heir of a proud dynasty, and suddenly you are married off, not to a man of your choice, but to an ally of Rome, a general, or even a rival king under Rome's thumb. Overnight, you become a pawn in the empire's game. Your children would not belong to your people. They would be born as Romans, their loyalty tied to the empire. Your bloodline, once the pride of your nation, became a weapon to secure Rome's dominance. We see this strategy in the story of Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. After her parents' downfall, she was spared, but not out of mercy. Octavian used her as a political bride, marrying her to King Juba II of Mauritania. This marriage wasn't about love. It was about Rome planting its influence in Africa. Cleopatra Selene's royal heritage became Rome's tool to control another kingdom. This was the brilliance of Roman conquest. They didn't just conquer armies. They conquered bloodlines. By forcing noblewomen into new dynasties, Rome erased old kingdoms and rewrote history in its own image. But for the women, it was a life sentence of sorrow. Imagine watching your own children grow up under the very empire that destroyed your family, your people, your nation. To them, survival was not victory. It was betrayal forced upon them. Some women were kept as hostages in Rome itself, living in gilded cages. They might enjoy wealth, comfort, even education. But make no mistake, they were prisoners. Their presence ensured that their fathers or brothers back home would never dare rebel. Because one wrong move, and their daughters' lives could be ended in an instant. Rome understood something chilling. Death silences, but survival chains you forever. And these chained survivors, these broken queens and princesses, became living symbols of Rome's absolute power. In Part 5, we'll uncover the darkest layer of all, when humiliation turned into pure cruelty, and some women were thrown into the jaws of Rome's bloodthirsty entertainment, the gladiatorial games. Up to now, we've seen how Rome enslaved, humiliated, and even used noblewomen as political pawns. But what if I told you, for some captives, the cruelty went even further, into the blood-soaked sands of Rome's arenas? The Colosseum wasn't just a place for gladiators. It was the empire's theater of dominance, where human lives became entertainment. And for certain women of conquered peoples, this arena became the stage of their final humiliation. Some captives, even noblewomen, were paraded into the arena, not as fighters, but as victims. Imagine the roar of 50,000 Roman citizens as a queen or princess, stripped of her royal dignity, was forced into the center of the sand. She would be mocked, displayed, and sometimes executed in front of the cheering crowd. The empire turned her suffering into a festival. Roman writers speak of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Prisoners were thrown into the arena, left to be mauled by lions, leopards, or bears for the amusement of the public. To Rome, it was the ultimate statement. Even the most noble blood means nothing when spilled before the empire, and if death was not chosen for them, humiliation was. Some women were made part of staged plays, forced to act in mythological dramas where their deaths were real. For example, they might be dressed as a tragic heroine like Andromeda, only to be chained to a rock and devoured by wild beasts in front of a screaming audience. The line between theater and execution disappeared. This was Rome's cruel genius. They didn't simply kill enemies. They erased their honor, their dignity, and even their memory. To survive as a slave was torture. To die in the arena was humiliation so public that no dynasty could recover from it. The crowd loved it. For them, this was proof that Rome was eternal, that no queen, no ruler, no foreign bloodline could ever stand against their empire. The women who once carried crowns became spectacles of pity, their deaths nothing more than an afternoon's entertainment. It is hard to imagine a fate more brutal. And yet Rome believed it was necessary, because through blood and humiliation, they secured their dominance for centuries. But in Part 6, we will uncover the lasting impact of this cruelty, how Rome's treatment of defeated women sent ripples across history, shaping how conquerors for centuries learned to use humiliation as the sharpest weapon of all. By now you've seen the darkest side of Rome, how they enslaved, humiliated, and even turned noblewomen into living trophies and bloody entertainment. But here's the question: why does this matter today? Because Rome didn't just shape the ancient world. They shaped the playbook of power for every empire that followed. Think about it. When a conqueror humiliates an enemy's wife or daughter, they're not just breaking a person, they're breaking a nation's spirit. The Romans knew this. That's why they paraded queens in chains, married princesses into foreign dynasties, or threw them to the beasts. It wasn't random cruelty. It was strategy, and history copied them. From medieval Europe to the Mongols, from the Ottomans to colonial empires, rulers learned the same lesson. Humiliate the women of your enemy, and you erase their future. Rome turned humiliation into a weapon sharper than any sword, and its echoes are still felt centuries later. For the women, survival was never freedom. It was a sentence, to live as a shadow of what they once were, to raise children for the empire that destroyed their bloodline, or to die screaming before a cheering crowd. This was the true cruelty of Rome. We often hear about Roman glory, the legions, the emperors, the architecture. But beneath the marble arches and golden victories lies a darker truth. Rome's power was built not only on conquest, but on humiliation. And for many women, death would have been the kinder fate. So the next time you hear about the greatness of Rome, remember this hidden chapter. The queens in chains, the princesses erased, the mothers broken. Because their silence tells us more about the cost of empire than any victory ever could. And if you want to uncover more of these dark and untold stories of history, stories that textbooks never dare to reveal, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next is even more shocking.